Well, hello again. This is Greg, and today we're not brewing. We are making bread. Uh, I like to think of my brewery slash bakery, better known as my kitchen, uh, as a place where I can do whatever I want with grain and consider it all the same thing. So today we're gonna go through a fairly simple or straightforward bread recipe. So my learning comes from this book by Ken Forkish, and there's some really cool recipes in here. They're all very straightforward. They have four ingredients, as the title says: flour, water, salt, and yeast. That's all that goes into the breads. It's critical that you also have a couple of other things available to you. They recommend wicker bannetons. I don't have those. I have glass bowls for the proofing stage. You need a couple of these. This is a Dutch oven. You also need the lid. And of course you need a space to work in and some bowls in which you're going to handle your dough. Let's go through the process. Step 1 is to authorize 1,000 grams of flour. I have my flour in a giant bag on the ground, so I'm scooping it in. This is a somewhat makeshift way to deal with the situation, but it is what happens in the middle of an apocalypse. The flour I'm using is full strength. This, I don't believe, is ideal bread flour, but it is what was available on the internet. When all of the other flour is out, you take whatever flour that you can get. And if that flour happens to come in 50-pound bags, then it comes in 50-pound bags. The first step we're going to do is the autolysis. And in this step, we're going to take our 1,000 grams of flour and add a little bit of water. Well, actually a very specifically prescribed amount of water. 720 grams, between 90 and 95 degrees Fahrenheit. So whether this will come into focus is always a question, but you can see my thermometer there. It's maybe a little bit on the warm side. I tend to be brave with this particular step and just weigh the water straight into the container in which I put the flour. It is often ideal if you don't have such sure hands that you weigh out the water separately and then add it. But I've been fairly consistently able to do this. My years of doing chemistry probably helps. That I can pretty much hit 720 spot on. Well, close enough. Slightly too much water. Terrible idea to take water out because might also be taking flour out with it at the same time. So we will just leave it at that. Having measured our materials out, we gotta mix this. As advised by the author, I tend to do this with my bare hands because what makes you feel closer to bread than actually sticking your hands in it? Nothing, except maybe eating it, but we have to get to the eating part by baking it first. I personally prefer to wash my hands before I do this. That's a personal affectation in that I want to make sure that I don't get any off flavors in here. I usually figure my hands are clean enough, and even if they weren't, this is going to get baked. I am doing this in a short order kind of a manner, so other things aren't going to have a lot of time. So if my hands had germs on it, it's unlikely that those germs would grow in this medium in the amount of time that it's going to have. But, you know, it's good protocol to wash your hands anyway. On the other hand, you also want to make sure that whatever you're washing your hands with, you end up thoroughly rinsing off. It would probably be unfortunate if you ended up with citrus or lavender flavored bread because your citrus or lavender soap ended up in your bread. Never had that happen to me, but that is a thing I worry about, perhaps because I don't know enough about bread baking, perhaps because I'm a chemist. You'll notice that I'm trying to get all of the flour to be mixed into the water, and it's definitely sticking to my fingers. The only goal here is incorporation, so once this is sufficiently mixed that all of the flour, or at least the vast majority of the flour, is attached to this ball of dough, we can stop. I'm not looking to knead this. It's also of note that this full strength flour gives a very, very tough dough. Even in these very early stages, using different kinds of flour will give you a different texture. This gives rather tough. And so now you can see my hands are covered in dough. It would be a real shame to have all of that dough go to waste. I have actually done the experiment of weighing how much dough I walk away with if I walk away with it. That giant chunk, I've never weighed how much that is. But after the thorough scraping I'm going to do here, I usually still end up with about 10 grams of loss per mixing. So that's a thing to keep in mind. It's not dramatic. It's an inevitable consequence of baking. But I did have to know, so I measured how much dough I am losing every time I walk out or walk away from the dough with sticky hands. Balancing effort with yield, this is about as clean as I tend to bother to get my hands. So now we have this ball of flour and water. This is a stage where what we're allowing to do is for some remaining enzymes to become active in the flour and do a little bit of digestion of the sugars, so we'll get a more effective feeding of the yeast once we get to that stage. This does actually have some similarities to brewing, so there's a reason why brewing and baking end up going hand to hand. There's some similarity with this stage and the mashing stage of brewing, so I always enjoy making those little connections between the different approaches for the two different arts. So we're gonna cover this up, give it 20 minutes, and then add the next stage of components. In addition to flour, water, and what you might expect, yeast, we also need salt. This particular recipe calls for 21 grams. The thing to know about these particular balances, although this is actually one of the more expensive ones, is that they tend to be relatively bad at measuring very fine amounts at very low values. So measuring 21 grams can be a little tricky, and I tend to tap mine to kind of reset it so that it falls back to a new normal. As you can see, it keeps bouncing between 21 and 22, gives you some feel for where it actually is sitting. And because it is poor at that, I would normally weigh everything, but I don't have a balance good enough to measure my yeast. So my yeast, I end up usually measuring out a teaspoon, it's supposed to be 4 grams. It usually comes out essentially 4 grams when I add it to my salt, but I tend to measure it out by teaspoon. This looks like it's gonna, well, there's so little in there, I might as well just throw it all in here. So not exactly a flat teaspoon, but pretty close. So you can see that's pretty much 4 grams of yeast right there, or 1 teaspoon. So that's my non-flour and water stuff. This doesn't look very exciting, relatively speaking. It's just dough. But we're gonna put the mixture of salt and yeast on top. I try to make sure I spread it out at this stage so that when we start mixing this together, we end up mixing it more uniformly. The salt isn't there for flavor, but also because salt slows down the rate at which yeast can grow. So we don't want the yeast to go completely nuts. Gives us time so that the bread can develop over time to be nice and bready. I've never tried to do this without salt. It would be interesting just to see. Now I have a little container of water here on the side because the mixing and folding is best done with a wet hand so that the dough doesn't stick to your hand. And this method can be found in Forkish's book, or there are places online people have described the same folding method. I don't know where it originates, but I've been using it. So you fold and then cut. I tend to cut both directions because I'm a neurotic chemist, but then fold and cut. And you do this for several minutes until everything is thoroughly mixed. I usually find around 5 minutes in my experience is enough time to get things thoroughly mixed. Sometimes less, sometimes a little bit more. You can re-wet your hand in the middle of this process. You will probably need to re-wet your hand, or the dough will start sticking to your hand and then it makes it much harder to actually mix things. You can see the dough tightening up. It's now tight enough that I can pull on part of it and it'll pull up the whole chunk of dough. And that is part of what we want. If you're using a different kind of dough, a different kind of flour, you might not find this process as physically demanding. As I mentioned earlier, use of different flours will lead to slightly different or sometimes drastically different feels for the dough. So at least by feel, that's about as mixed as I want it, which usually means I do one more fold and mix and fold, just because And then you flip the whole thing over so that the folds won't unfurl on the top. They're kind of trapped on the bottom. And then we let it rest. Having let this rest for a couple of minutes, we're going to give it one last fold. So my hand is still a little bit wet. I actually didn't bother drying it off. I'm going to make sure that this tightens up a little bit as we're doing this, and you can actually feel it getting tighter as I'm doing these last few folds. Maybe you can even see how much more it's resisting. And then give it a flip. Now if you want to be proper about it, we'll even measure the temperature. We should be looking at somewhere around 78. So we got slightly over 80, or maybe actually, if we look carefully, spot on 80. 78 to 80, that's not a bad place to be. That's where we wanted this. And now we're going to let it rise, and we'll have to fold it a few times, but for at least the next little while, maybe half an hour, we can let it sit and hang out. Our dough needs 2 folds, and here goes the first one. You can already see the textural changes. There's a little bit of activity in here. I wet my hand. I really like working with this full strength dough because it gives such a satisfying, strong dough, and it is really tasty. But that is fold number 1. We did this about 40 minutes in, and then maybe 20-30 minutes I'll do the next one, and then we wait until it's done rising. Now we're going to give it a second fold. You can see it tighten up just with the 4 or 5 folds we're giving it here. And then we'll let it rise until it's ready, and then we'll bake. Well, actually we'll proof, and then we'll bake.